You know, 2022 has been a fairly uneventful year for cinema, and not in the way you may think. After 2 years of COVID, after not being able to go back to our beloved theaters for so long, not only are movies back in a big way, but we've even managed to get into September without any behind-the-scenes Oh dear God. Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Don't Worry Darling is... well, it's undeniably here, that's for sure. Honestly, when's the last time the event of a film premiere, not the film, but the premiere itself, became an enduring sensation for memes and jokes? It's been an absolute shit show since Venice, and that's before we even get into the way the film itself has been received, which is, oh lord.
Not great, Bob.
Needless to say, despite its title, I think there's a lot to worry about with Don't Worry Darling. So when I got a chance to see the film stateside, I went into it expecting, well, an absolute train wreck, even though I was very intrigued by the trailers. I like Olivia Wilde. I thought Booksmart was a great, fresh take on the coming-of-age story, and the cast alone was enough to get me excited, especially with Florence Pugh leading the charge here. So I sat my ass down, fully prepared to be disappointed, and you know what? I actually really enjoyed this film. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is definitely not a masterpiece. I don't love the movie. There are clear issues at hand here with an at times undercooked story, a big band of characters who feature even less development, and unremarkable performances that are only balanced out by Florence Pugh and Chris Pine being on top form. But I don't think Don't Worry Darling is the outright disaster it's been pegged as. I think that it features a pretty stunning aesthetic, proposes some really interesting ideas and commentary even if it doesn't fully capitalize on them, and in spite of everything else that might go against the movie, it's very watchable thanks to Florence Pugh. I don't think Olivia Wilde should be written off as a filmmaker because of this just yet, and I don't even think the film itself deserves to be ignored. It's fine. So I'll get cracking a few eggs and get ready to host all of you for the best 50s style house party of 2022 as I dive into what works, what doesn't work, what's there but could have been improved, and overall, the reasons why Don't Worry Darling is ultimately a good movie. But first, the cornerstone of any great party, a great cup of coffee. Trade Coffee is here to make you feel like you're living your best 50s fantasy life with your ultimate cup of joe. Trade is a coffee subscription service that partners with the best local roasters across America to help you curate the perfect coffee for you and ship straight from the roaster to your door as often as you like. You all know that I've been a Trade subscriber for many years now, and I constantly sing the praises of this subscription service. It was like night and day to go from drinking coffee as a thing to keep me awake to having the best coffee of my goddamn life. And being such a fan of their service, it's been incredible for Trade to work with me to curate my own custom FilmSpeak collection, including two of my absolute favorite coffees out there, Crazy Goat by Klatch and Rise and Shine by Greater Goods. Goddamn, I love Greater Goods. They're so freaking, well, great. Getting that signature red bag delivered right to my door is still the highlight of my week. And if you're like me with a coffee addiction, you blow through beans over the course of the week like it's no one else's business, you're getting 2 of those bags. Look, I love my dark roasts, but if you're not as partial to dark roasts as I am, no problem. Trade will have the right coffee for you. So if you want to support small businesses and brew the best cup of coffee you've ever made at home, it's time to try Trade Coffee right now. Right now, Trade is offering our viewers a total of $30 off your first order, plus free shipping at drinktrade.com/filmspeak. That's drinktrade.com/filmspeak for $30 off your subscription to the best coffees in the country. Seriously, guys, this is a great deal. Please take advantage of it. And thank you so much, as always, to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video. It's not immediately obvious where to even begin with Don't Worry Darling. It's undeniable that the movie is complicated, maybe even a mess, despite the fact that I like it. Let's take a look at what the movie does well, though, because I do think there's more to like here than dislike. And since we spend so much of the film in it, I think that Olivia Wilde and the production design team deserve to be commended for the way they capture the post-war mid-50s to early 60s setting. I actually think they nail it to such a flawless degree that it even benefits the story. It feels too good, too perfect to be true, and that might raise a voice in the back of your head that the whole thing is bullshit. I made a Mad Men joke in the intro, and that was by design. I think if you watch an episode from the first or second season of that show next to Don't Worry Darling, you'll see what I'm getting at. Both of these properties are set during the baby boomer era, the idealized golden era of America, but Mad Men is much more frank about how the good old days weren't always that. Is there glamour and vibrancy in Mad Men? Nostalgia? It's delicate but potent. Absolutely, but it never feels superficial or dishonest. Speaking on Don't Worry Darling, Olivia Wilde said the following: "We were really interested in the kind of problematic nature of nostalgia itself for everyone, but a very slim portion of the population. And we started writing this film in the era of Make America Great Again, and we were really questioning what exactly is meant by that. I think also with this film, you have to remember everything is a metaphor. The paradox of victory is that everything that is beautiful is also sinister. That's by design. Don't Worry Darling starts off so unblemished, so happy-go-lucky, so idealized to an almost disgustingly sugary level that the mere way the era is portrayed is unsettling. It creates a subtle feeling that Wilde is attempting to deceive you, because she is. This isn't something that sits in the forefront of your mind or anything. The rest of what happens in the story will surely draw your attention away from thinking about it anyway, but it's just some tiny sense that something is off. That feels like the right execution for this type of story. And you know what? Sure. The Truman Show already did this 25 years ago. Pleasantville, the Stepford Wives. I'm certainly not going to try and claim that Peter Weir didn't do a better job, even though in that film the reveal is only ever a reveal for Truman, whereas the audience is in on it from the start. Don't Worry Darling, on the other hand, makes a proper twist out of it, but that doesn't mean Olivia Wilde did a bad job. She's establishing a very specific feeling here, and for my money, she accomplished that. However the rest of the film lands for you, she got the beginning right. The first act is a win. You could even call it a victory project.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
The aforementioned victory project, sort of the big antagonist of the whole film, is pretty blatant about its aims. There is beauty in control, grace and symmetry. We move as one. They claim to be changing the world, but really they just want to control women. The men are the breadwinners, the hard workers, the ones in the know, while the women should just shut up, cook, clean, host, and please their husbands. It presents a different angle of the bullshit version of the 50s that Florence Pugh's Alice is living in. The women are all obedient, to the word, to the letter, to the day, to the second, of what the men ask. It's absolutely ridiculous. It misrepresents women of the time as being robots, obedient without fail, and it's by design, because, spoiler alert, this is the future that the incels running the whole place want. They want the 50s and 60s of Don't Worry Darling, not the one of Mad Men, ironically, because it's what gives them control. It's what makes them feel valuable because, God forbid, a woman have a career, independence, wants and desires that extend beyond her husband's achievements. And the film unhesitantly calls them out on their shit. This becomes much more apparent later on, but it's there from the beginning. The film also kind of works as this commentary on the male-dominated workplace and how they manufacture consent and conformity. The boys' club mentality, if you will. A lot of this comes from the men going into work every day, trying to appease the boss and get career advancements, even if it means submitting to the unethical actions of their boss, as is the case with Alice's husband Jack, and the leader of this cult, community, Frank. Jack just sort of lets Frank do what he wants, never asks questions because it would ruin his career, ruin the livelihood that he has. This eventually crescendos to a scene where Frank promotes Jack at a party and has Jack perform to an audience in reciprocation, literally dancing like Pinocchio while Frank has him like a puppet on a string. Jack is submissive in the workplace, which leads to his overwhelming need to be dominant in a domestic setting to compensate. The women are there to support, go to parties, dance, do housework, and that's it. The men drive off and work on top-secret projects centered around the development of progressive materials, insinuating the patriarchal decision-making that determines what progress is and isn't for the rest of us, especially when it comes to women and their autonomy, or bodily autonomy. And even when their husbands aren't around, the routine the wives go about day to day is meticulous, monotonous, gamed out. Their route to go to the store is a charade. The trips to the store are a charade. It's all a big fucking perfectly composed lie. The eggs aren't even real. They're empty shells, a mindless distraction to prevent them from waking up to what's really going on. Routine by way of control. It's all about dominance. Alice breaks the predetermined routine when she sees a plane crash and goes after it. Her bus driver won't stray away from the path, and so she sets off to do the right thing and help the crash victims, and wanders into the desert in the process. That's the big no-no here. The desert is off limits to the women. Her friend Margaret tried to escape with her son into the desert after she began to awaken, and after she was caught, the Victory Project took her son away as punishment. With Alice, her journey into the desert led her to a glass dome, at which point she loses consciousness and wakes up back in her Victory Project-sanctioned pre-configured life, prevented from shattering the glass ceiling. She's back to where the women are more concerned about how they make their husbands look than they are about their own freedom or safety, where the other women, Wilde's character Bunny especially, are convinced that living this dutiful home life serves some sort of great purpose. I should mention the first significant hiccup the film has, though, which is the whole crashing plane thing is brought up multiple times, but it's never really addressed, and in general, there are also other interesting kernels of visual metaphors presented at different times within the film, but sadly, not all of them coalesce in any real satisfying manner. It cobbles up a bunch of dystopian ideas, puts them in the cook, only to pull them out of the oven before they're really finished. It also just feels like the film is juggling way too many ideas for its own good, ideas that are only really loosely connected. The dancer metaphor, for example, the performance the women of Victory put on, feels like the best example of this. The idea that they are these clowns for the amusement of the patriarchy feels like a really compelling idea. It's interesting, it adds to some of the more disturbing, trippy sequences in the film, where Alice sees the dancing through a get-out sunken place-like environment, as she almost peers through the looking glass. But there's sadly way too many of these vague metaphors that, when you really think about it, just harp on the same basic idea of feminism 101, and the film banks way too hard on repeating the same images in these dream sequences that happen far too frequently. And it's cool, you can have dream sequences, but don't rely on them to convey the same message over and over again, especially when it's something as simple as what the movie is getting at. It's really not going out of its way to say anything of depth that we haven't seen in other movies, like the ones I just mentioned earlier in this video. But of course, as the film goes on, we see Alice being gaslit hard by the men of the Victory Project because she's the rebellious one, the one who questions the very nature of her reality, the one who needs to get back in line. They don't seem to be as concerned, though, about Alice's friend Margaret, who had her child abducted from her when she started to awaken to the nature of her reality, as I've already mentioned, begins to have more of these episodes and starts to feel the constriction of the community around her. And the community naturally writes it off as, oh, she's just unwell, she's having mental issues. And you almost wonder if maybe they're using Margaret's downward spiral to further gaslight Alice. I don't know, it moves the story along, but feels a bit bare bones. Either way, Margaret pleads for help, yet no one listens, not even Alice. Everyone writes her off as being hysterical, unwell, constricting her until she's left with no other option than to slice her throat in front of Alice, signaling the ultimate wake-up call for her friend who's just begun to awaken herself. The Victory Project doesn't even hesitate to twist this as being an event that Alice has somehow misunderstood or misremembered. We are so lucky to be here. Keep calm and carry on. Oh, you know, Margaret just had deeply rooted psychological issues. It wasn't because we kept her as a prisoner in a make-believe world or anything. It's one thing that Alice is waking up to all of this, but it's also part of the tragic element that she's flabbergasted that nobody believes her, when Alice isn't the first woman this has happened to, and Alice herself was part of the chorus that didn't believe them. She was part of the problem when she was unaware that the problem existed, but now that the problem is affecting her, she finds herself faced with a bunch of women who are the person she used to be. They move as one. The beginning of the movie even talks about the role of women as being a unified front for their husbands that take on a new meaning afterwards, where Alice's goal is to unite them to move as one, not in service of the patriarchy or their husbands or victory, but rather in all being their own unique free person, and looking out for one another, and listening to one another, and trusting them when they say that something is wrong, that they're unwell, that something isn't right. We thought a lot about the generations of women that came before ours, but unfortunately, also the generation of women that we are in right now, in terms of bodily autonomy. It was a huge part of why we wanted to tell the story. But you know what? I'll defend the messy way that the filmmaking and story start to play out here. The execution is far from perfect, but again, I think that's kind of the point. This is a film that is almost entirely portrayed through Alice's POV, and this is the part of the film where she's most distressed, where she's being gaslit the most, where, again, spoiler alert, the illusion she's living in is truly beginning to crumble. It's as this goes on that Alice begins to become more and more trapped by her own reflection, including a window that presses her against a wall while she cleans it, and a mirror in her bathroom, which, when she goes underwater, her expression, her reflection doesn't change as she just slips under the water. I think this is supposed to represent the fact that real Alice is confined and restrained within the virtual setup that real Jack has trapped her in. The ideas here aren't unique, but they are interesting nonetheless, and if the film dug deeper into them through a modern lens so that the audience didn't have to take wild stabs in the dark about what something does or doesn't mean, I think that alone would have saved it from the critical thrashing it's gotten. It's presented with a lot of craft. It works for a while, but I wanted more depth in Alice's interactions with the other women, the other characters in general, because I think that in turn would have given the ideas more depth. The film almost gets tunnel vision focusing on Alice's POV to the detriment of literally everything else going on in the story, especially Bunny, Olivia Wilde's character, who we learn is aware of what is going on, but is content to keep the patriarchal gender role fantasy going on because she can be a dutiful housewife and mother, because reality, where she's lost her kids, is so much worse in her eyes. So she perpetuates the theft of all these other women's agency because it's more convenient for her. It allows her to have what she wants. Again, give me more than a handful of lines during the climax. Actually explore that idea in contrast with Alice. Hell, you'd even make up for the overall lackluster performances. Now, like I said, Don't Worry Darling is almost entirely committed to being a POV piece for Alice, and therefore Florence Pugh. The way she conveys hopelessness, despair, joy, sadness, horror, madness, catharsis over the course of this story, the effortlessness with which she drifts from one to the other in some scenes, the work she does with only her eyes. Again, this is what we expect from Florence Pugh at this point, but it doesn't make it any less satisfying to see one of the best actresses of her generation bring it home every time, especially in what is essentially a one-woman show. Other than her, though, I think Chris Pine is the only other actor in the film who comes even close to her level, although that isn't really helped by the fact that he has basically no screen time outside of one scene together. They have a very strong dynamic, with Pine effortlessly slipping into the slimy, swarmy, Weasley, incel Jordan Peterson-like douchebag that is Frank. But even he's let down by a lack of character depth, or really, again, a lack of screen time. Yeah, the way that he and Alice challenge one another is great, but if you're hoping to see how that antagonistic dynamic develops beyond that dinner table scene from the trailer, well, hope is a dangerous thing, I guess. There's the hint of a power struggle between them, this battle for control. The whole film is about control, about dominance and submissiveness. He lets her pull at those loose threads in the tapestry out of morbid curiosity, almost out of amusement, so that he can try and come down harder with his dominance. He admires her spirit, similar to some online personalities that relish in the idea of a debate. He gets off on the challenge, on thinking he has the upper hand, someone to combat him equivalently on the opposite side, and so he doesn't shut Alice down immediately. Over the course of one scene, we see he becomes dissatisfied with how she matches him, and then that's really the end of it. We don't really get a resolution to that idea, and in fact, the conclusion for Frank's character happens while he's off screen. Frank deserved way more screen time. That dynamic with Alice deserved way more screen time, because it's great stuff when it's happening, but come on, you can't just give us one scene and expect that to be enough for what is essentially the core problem of the film. This is otherwise a hodgepodge of performances that range from uneven to pitifully one note, and I think the worst culprit might be...
And if you keep talking like this, you're gonna put it all at risk. Our life. Alice, our life together.
Jack just isn't much of a character on the page, and Harry Styles lacks the emotional range and nuance required to texturize what's already a thin character. So for as easy as it is to blame poor Harry Styles, it's truthfully the writing that lets him down. And look, I loved him in Dunkirk. He was great as an angry, scared, and paranoid soldier, but here, he's either entirely too understated or bursting from the seams with outwardly aggressive emotion. I don't think he sells any of Jack's faux sensitivity in the earlier parts of the film, and then by the time the twist comes along, it's barely a, oh yeah, that twist. Are you ready for that? Yeah, let's go into that. So, Jack is a loser who signed up for a virtual program where he picks a woman, keeps her captive, chooses his life, and is only responsible for keeping her alive in the real world. Real Alice is his girlfriend, or ex-girlfriend that I think he's tried to get back multiple times, who he felt emasculated by because she was better at building a career for herself than he was at doing for himself, so he signed up to imprison her in this virtual fantasy where he can have value, have dominance, reclaim control over his miserable failure of a life by controlling someone else's. He can look after his perfect housewife and live in a patriarchal fantasy world of his own design. Wow, that was a lot. Yeah. So for starters, Harry Styles is completely miscast because of the true nature of the character in the real world. The jealous loser who's mad that his girlfriend has a budding career where she works long hours and he waits around all day for her, and then she comes home and is too tired for sexual intimacy. He has nothing going for him, so it's the reversal of what's happening in this 50s, 60s fantasy world. I just don't buy Harry Styles as a basement-dwelling grunge incel. There's this idea presented in the film that the glue that holds a relationship together is sexual satiation and food, as illustrated by Jack going down on Alice on the dinner table. It's what he was deprived of in his relationship with Alice in the real world, and so he put that at the forefront of his dominance over Alice in the dystopian reality. Anyway, the twist is fine, and I think a lot of us saw it coming, but it also feels like a sudden dive into sci-fi. It feels way too on the nose, and the fact that it happens with such immediacy doesn't help. There's really no time to process it, and the film doesn't even really go into it in much depth. The movie basically turns into The Matrix without the layers or nuance. It decides to bash you over the head and scream, "Hey, look at these bad men." And the weird part is, the movie thinks it's being clever. It thinks it's saying something interesting, that it has nuance, but really it's just screaming the whole time, and then it gets to this point and it's yelling even more, which, like, you know, that's fine. You can do that. The movie's not projecting a bad message. I mean, obviously we know that these people are bad, that incels are bad. It's just, why suddenly come at me with a bigger sledgehammer after you were being pretty obvious with what you were doing? Anyway, Alice starts to wake the other women up, aka The Matrix, and they proceed to kill Jack and Frank, since if a man dies here, a man dies in the real world, aka The Matrix, and ultimately the women free themselves from their captive husbands and take their place in the real world with their own agency and independence. Again, aka The Matrix. So that's Don't Worry Darling, and yeah, I get why a lot of people hate it, and while I get that it's a POV story and it's built upon Alice and Florence Pugh, that doesn't mean you shouldn't develop the other characters. Chris Pine and Frank is the only other character that feels interesting, or at least more than one-dimensional, but the movie even undercuts that by not giving him and Pugh the proper amount of screen time together that they should have had. Explore his motivations better, or even Wilde's character and her complacency. While I admire her restraint in not giving herself an hour of screen time, the reality is that her character gets so little screen time, so little attention, and is one of the more interesting pieces to the puzzle here, that her obedient foil to Alice's rebellion doesn't properly get interrogated on screen. So many of the twists and reveals in the climax feel rushed as a result of a non-committal story, like the seed of good ideas that weren't worked on properly and allowed to bloom. Even Jack, who on paper the climax most serves character-wise, is let down by a weak performance that not even acting opposite Florence Pugh could save. If anything, it just illustrates that he's not really up to the level that he needs to be in order to be in this movie. The thin writing could have been made up for by some real gravitas. Pugh's performance elevates Alice, and a better actor could have elevated Jack. The overall issue with Don't Worry Darling is ultimately the derivative, repetitious commentary about gender politics that doesn't add anything new to the conversation and is only dampened further by the aforementioned lack of depth to the supporting cast. So, Don't Worry Darling is a mess, and yet, I like Don't Worry Darling, but I also realize that it's missing way too many pieces for me to love it the way I want to.